Okay, so I'm recording and broadcasting. Okay, so I'm recording it and broadcasting it, so afterwards, I don't know how long I'll be able to record because I don't have a pro account. We'll see if it works. And hopefully afterwards you can watch the video instead if the quality was too poor. I don't really know what else to do. I will also, I have notes for what I'm going to say. I can email those around to you as well. So that you can have a copy of what I was going to say. It's about 5 pages. So hopefully this will work out. I'm going to get started. It's about time, and we have the same 8 viewers, so that's all of you. Thank you for coming. I'm not getting paid to do this, so I thought I might start off with talking about why I'm doing it. So I gave you all critical feedback that was meant to help you improve. But I felt many of you might also benefit from some pointers on how to approach essays in the first place, and we didn't have time for this in class. Though those of you who had Art of War studies with me will have heard some of this before, and you may be able to recognize some bits from Dr. Honig's lectures as well. Having to multitask here a little bit. I'm getting messages in a couple places. Okay. Okay. Yes, Tulio, I am recording. All right. In the meantime, hold off on questions. Send me stuff if you are having a lot of trouble, but otherwise wait for questions until the end, and then we'll get to those so I don't get distracted. Okay, so yeah, it's really meant to help you. I had a talk yesterday with one of you, and this person related to me how hard it was to read the criticisms when she had been at the top of her class in school previously and wasn't used to getting criticism. That's something that many of you may also feel. It's something that I went through as well, and I'm sorry for the pain, but I'm not sorry for inflicting it. So I'm sympathetic to how it feels, but I feel it's the right way to go. If I thought writing better arguments was about talent rather than skill, there would be no point in commenting so much. But it isn't. Talent matters a lot, but most of formulating and writing arguments involves skills that must be learned and practiced. And as I told the student yesterday, they're like workouts. If it doesn't hurt, you're not getting better. So understand that criticism is actually a backhanded compliment. If it's given in earnest, meant to help you, it assumes you're smart enough to improve. And I assume that you're smart enough to improve, and I think that you are. I have the evidence that you are. You're all smart. You're all at King's, so you can all get better, which is why I'm criticizing you, not because I think you're not good. So don't make that mistake. Otherwise, there wouldn't be any point. If I thought you were idiots, I just wouldn't bother. I would just write barely any comments and just get through it and get my money. So, yes, you can improve, and I have faith in you. So don't interpret criticism too negatively. Everyone has their viewpoints, and if you think I'm biased against your argument, that's good for you, actually, because it will give you practice. I'm not saying that I am biased. I try very hard not to be biased, but nobody can be completely unbiased. So it gives you practice against for what you're going to do in the future, because the point of debate is to convince people who disagree with you, not the people who already agree. There's no point in that. Okay, so enough of the why I'm doing this. The webinar is broken into 4 parts. Thinking about the question, narrowing the focus, structuring your argument, and a question and answer section at the end. So there are only 3 bits about how to write the question. Okay, so the first part is thinking about the question. I've told you guys before to think about what the question really means, and is it completely straightforward or open to interpretation? I think some of you went too far and started really thinking about possible ways a question could be interpreted when some of them may have been fairly straightforward and you didn't need to worry about them too much. But other ones are open to interpretation. And when you think about whether they're open to interpretation, it's important to think about whether there's an interpretation that stands out as better than the others. For example, if we take the question, can infrastructures ever be secured? One student pointed out that the ever in the question makes it sound like the question is whether infrastructures can be 100% secure. And that's certainly a fair interpretation of the question. But I would also then ask, does that make sense? Is it a good question? And I would argue no, as I told the student yesterday, because the vast majority of people take it as given that nothing can ever be 100% secure. You could argue that that question, based on the limitation of humans' comprehension of the world, the fact that we cannot foresee all outcomes, and just that we therefore cannot prevent them. We can't prevent things that we can't foresee. So just writing that in a paragraph would likely be enough, and you'd be done. But that's not very controversial and not very interesting, even with nice illustrative examples like the sinking of the Titanic and the collapse of Interstate 80 in an earthquake in Los Angeles. Two examples that come to my mind. They're both things that should not have happened. We predicted that they wouldn't happen, and yet they did. So nothing can ever be 100% safe. But yeah, anyone writing in a journal about the topic would start by saying nothing can ever be 100% secure, but we can ... So I think a more interesting question would be to define security in less absolute terms and possibly also include mitigating the effects of infrastructure failure for that question in particular. But you could broaden that out to any question. So think about what interpretation of the question makes the most sense and is an interesting question. Okay. Oh, good. We're up to 10 viewers. Okay. When you have some sort of question like that about then the effects of infrastructure failure, how we can make things relatively safe, you have a really big question. And that was one of the main problems that many of you had, was that you felt the questions were broad. Students always complain that questions are broad. But broad questions are actually useful because, in a way, you can answer them however you want. And that brings me to the next part, which is narrowing the focus. So many of the questions posed in this course have multiple answers, multiple approaches, and thousands of variables. Not only that, I have to discuss and disarm counter-arguments as well as my own argument. And I'm going to talk about structuring that next. How in the world can I cover all that in depth in 1,500 words or less? Very common question, and I noticed a lot of you struggled with it. You brought in loads of different topics, but covered all of them sort of superficially. And I wrote that as a criticism, that they weren't very well covered. And many of you wrote back, there's not enough space. I get that a lot. There is enough space if you narrow things down a little bit. One way to do that is to spend a fair bit of time considering whether there is an essence to the question. Is there one big issue or case that stands out that anyone covering it ought to focus on and which you could focus all of your efforts on? So, and this is a Dr. Honig thing. So those of you who did Art of War studies, what is the essence? He talked about the Y and X chromosomes and things like that. It's the essence of difference between male and female. And we got into lots of postmodern debates about what male and female mean, but his point still stands. And to take an example from this class, was the world much safer with the end of the Cold War? If we ask ourselves what the big change was, one big potential issue becomes the threat of nuclear annihilation. That's probably the single biggest thing about the Cold War that people talk about as a big threat. And so you could reasonably focus your entire essay on that once you've argued that that's the most important thing in your introduction. So you would cover in the introduction, this is the main thing about it. And this essay will focus on nuclear annihilation. And then you could argue either way. You could argue that the threat is no longer there, so the world is safer, or you could say all those nuclear weapons are still around and nothing has changed, or you could argue something about proliferation and terrorists. That's up to you, and I read good and bad essays in both directions that argued the world safer, less safe, etc. But focusing on one big topic, the essence, the big thing that's changed, will help with that. Okay, sorry, I'm just reading some of the questions already. Okay, I'll get to those. By the way, for yes or no questions like that, a lot of these questions were yes or no, safer, less safe. They were binary. For any binary question, there are only 3 possible answers: yes, no, and I don't know because no one knows. All right. What is not acceptable is to argue a bit of both and then come to no conclusion. You need to argue something. But if you're going through all of the evidence and you say, I can't decide, it seems like this or it seems like that, then perhaps the question's not really answerable, and perhaps that needs to be what you argue. Perhaps you can't know, and frankly, all of these other people claiming they know are full of it, because you can't. You can't possibly know. And then you'd need to focus on how you can show that. That may not be easy. But you guys get to choose your essays, so maybe you choose a different topic then, or maybe you have an idea of how to do that and go for it. But don't argue this way and then argue that way and say it's a bit this and a bit that, unless you can really argue that it is a bit both, right? But you can't be both safer and less safe. You have to weigh which one of those factors is more important. But you can argue, I don't know if we're safe or not. And that applies to many of the other questions as well. If you can't discover an essence to talk about, try to think of an illustrative case instead. You should always use examples to back your arguments, of course. If I return to the Cold War question, using the case of the Cuban Missile Crisis is almost mandatory, for example. Everyone mentions it as a point of, we came very close. So you can't say it was perfectly stable and it was really ideal. But you can also use an illustrative case to discuss the entire topic. To illustrate the difficulty of securing infrastructures and also propose how they might be secured, for example, you might choose a water grid. And I talked about this with one of you yesterday. You could show that a water supply can be compromised at many points throughout the network, and that it's difficult or even impossible to control all of that network. Crucially, this is very similar to how other forms of infrastructure operate, so you can argue that the case of water infrastructure is illustrative of the difficulties with infrastructures in general. And a benefit of choosing a water grid is also that it's very simple. People can visualize how water is gathered, purified, delivered through pipes, etc., and how this could be disrupted or the water poisoned, for example. So it's very easy for people to imagine. It's a good illustrative case. And it requires a lot less specialist knowledge to argue it than you would need to have if you were talking about telecommunications or the internet, where you have to be pretty techie to get into good points about internet security. In other sorts of essays, you might argue that the experience of a particular country or region is illustrative of a wider issue, but be careful with all of these, because this can open you up to the criticism that it is not really comparable. You have to do some thinking about whether this approach really fits. So when you choose a case study, someone may say, this case was so individual you can't apply it to anything else, so it doesn't fit. And in broad questions like these, where you're answering something general, you do have to be a little bit careful about getting too specific. But as the case with water infrastructure shows, you can use an illustrative example to point to the problems in general. The final approach, if you can't find the essence and you can't think of a good case that would illustrate the whole thing, is to arbitrarily and unilaterally limit your focus. You can just say, this essay will focus on X, Y. You don't necessarily even need to explain yourself, though the aspect you choose should clearly be an important one. For the safer after the Cold War question, if the thing you choose is big enough, just one case could be enough to show we're not safer. So if you come up with one situation in the post-Cold War world that is really dangerous, enough that it really threatens us, then that could be enough to say, hey, we're not safer because look at this. So one thing could be enough. For the migration question, you could focus on one type of migration and discuss why it is or it can be a security issue. Sorry, I just can't read my notes here. Focusing on one type of security issue will not show if or why all types are. Oh, okay. If you focus on one type, it won't show why all of them are a security issue, but it can show you that at least one type is a security issue, and therefore you can show that migration in general has at least some points that are important. Again, though, you need to make sure you pick something that's clearly an important aspect. Otherwise, the criticism could be, why should anyone care about this? Make sure it's relevant and interesting. Beyond that, though, and assuming there isn't an essence or a clear illustrative case you could use, because I think you should try to do that if you can, there's absolutely nothing wrong with just saying, I'm going to focus on this one key aspect here. There are many types of migration, people moving all over the place, and migration security, the security issues in migration is not only about the migrants, but how native people respond to the migrants coming in. Therefore, this essay will focus on blah, blah, blah. on one particular aspect. And you see in the introduction that you've mentioned the many different aspects of it. So you can show that there's complexity, you can show that you understand that there's complexity, and then you can say, I'm not going to talk about all of that, I'm going to talk about one specific type that I think is important. That's perfectly fine. The final bit, this is the last part, and this is the easiest part, I think, is about structuring your argument. Everybody still there? Yeah, roughly. So your introduction should address, so first part is your introduction, obviously, and it should address all the things we've just spoken about. It should let the reader know what the question is, how the essay will interpret that question if it is unclear, and what, if anything, you will be focusing on. Once you've set that out, it should also briefly introduce the counter-argument and your criticism of that counter-argument, but just briefly. Don't assert too strongly yet in the introduction, because you want to convince the reader later with your argument and the evidence. But you do want to hook them and get them interested. What is it about? What do some people say, and why are all those people wrong, and why am I right? Oh, interesting. I've never heard that argument before. That's the hook that you're hoping to get. An example of this last bit for an intro could be commentators like A and B argue that nuclear proliferation poses a grave threat to the world today, full as it is of terrorists and unstable states. Though appealing, this argument is far from perfect. In fact, the risks from proliferation have mostly been overstated. That's the end. That could be an end of your introduction, for example. You've already told them what you're going to argue. You haven't told them exactly how, but interesting. Okay, as a reader, I know exactly what this is about, and I can anticipate a structure. You're going to talk about why proliferation is dangerous, and why those arguments are actually not that good, and why proliferation finally is not dangerous at the end. The reader now knows what the question is and what the question means as well, and what the essay will focus on. And then in the body, the first part you're going to talk about is the counter-argument. Couple things about that. Present it honestly. Don't try to misrepresent it in a way that weakens it, because this will open you up to criticism, and it's intellectually dishonest. So don't try to present intentionally a stupid version of the counter-argument to make it sound less plausible. You should present it well. And to do that, you have to know, understand, and appreciate the counter-argument despite disagreeing with it. So you need to engage with the people you disagree with and really listen and see if their argument makes sense before you try to counter it. The next step, and these could be paragraphs or sections, is, and they don't need to be explicit, now I'm going to counter this argument. You don't have to do that. You can just do it. The next section would be to tear the argument down. While you accept its strengths, and you can say that this, and this are valid points, however, you highlight its holes and the weaknesses to the point that the reader will hopefully accept that the counter-argument is definitely not unassailable. So you definitely can say something against it. And then you can provide examples to bring back to back the tearing down of the argument if possible. If you can think of examples that show, well, this isn't true. And then the last part, you present your argument. So you presented the counter-argument in all honesty what it is. You've presented why that counter-argument has flaws, and now you present your argument, which is much better. And be sure it's linked to the previous section. So it should fill the holes in the counter-argument. So if you've pointed out that it has all these holes, make sure your argument doesn't. You need to make sure that your argument's better, so it should fill in exactly those holes. So you should address the exact same points that you addressed in the counter-argument with the argument and say, here it is, this argument, and as you can see, it fills those holes perfectly. It works in all these circumstances where the counter-argument doesn't. That's why we should believe this. You should guide the reader through the logic of the argument and or the theory behind it, just as you will have done for the counter-argument, but better, and provide examples to back your case, and always cite sources, tell where you got ideas from, etc. And the last part of any essay is the conclusion, where you should bring it all together. Your chosen focus is a good focus on a key issue, you argue. Though others have argued X, Y, those arguments are flawed and yours are better. You might also tell the reader about the implications for society, government, the world, environment, women, migrants, whatever, if your argument is correct. So this is the place to answer the question, okay, so what? Okay, so your argument is correct. Why should we care? Well, this is why. This is the implications. That's what the conclusion is about. Don't just repeat everything that you've already said. Say, okay, so we've come to this, and this is why it matters. And that's it. You've nailed it. That's all there is to it. You'll notice if you read a journal article or a thesis or a book, they all follow the same basic format. There's really nothing to it. It's all the same. Okay, now I'll take questions. Hopefully you're still with me and able to hear this. It is still recording, so I can hopefully post it somehow afterwards. I don't know how to do that yet. Hopefully it'll work. Okay, so we have let's see. I have one notification on Twitter. I think it's just that someone's following me. Okay, a few people are following me, but no messages there. So it's all on the social thing. I have a couple of questions. Okay, Elena's question was about, can you tell us how to avoid making naive or utopian points? This happens to me sometimes. That's an interesting question. I think if you ask yourself, one way to make a naive point, I guess, why is his hair sticking up like that, is to, getting self-conscious. It's been like that for the last 20 minutes. One type of naive argument would be the sort of argument that something could be perfect. And as I talked about with the securing infrastructures question, assuming that the question means perfect security would be kind of silly. So avoiding absolutes is probably one way to avoid a naive or utopian argument. But I don't think an argument is naive or utopian if you can support it really well. So if you've got the counter argument and what people would say against that, and you're not convinced by it, and you can show why you're not convinced by it, and you can show why your argument is convincing, what's utopian about it? I'd have to probably see a specific case. So if you showed me something, not now, but if you showed me something where you had done that, maybe we could talk about it. I think the more you know and the more you learn, the less likely you are to have that happen as well, because you know lots about it. Ash asked, is it a good idea to apply realism, liberalism, and other IR theories to questions about interventions? It could be. I'm a little bit skeptical on theory for that sort of thing. So realists, for example, they used realism as a reason not to carry out the Iraq War, for example, the second Iraq War, because they saw Iraq as balancing Iran. So using very much a realist balance of power argument in the Middle East, and they said that's why we shouldn't do it. It had nothing to do with humanitarian reasons, values, anything else. So if you believe that, for example, you could potentially use it. Liberalism, absolutely. Any sort of intervention that is not... I think there are two reasons you could intervene. You could intervene as sort of a preventive war measure for security reasons, and then maybe realism would make sense. And there are liberal grounds for humanitarian intervention. The problem with using one of those theories really explicitly is that a lot of people don't agree with one or the other of them, and then they just won't listen to you. So I think it's better if you ignore that and make simply the case for it without talking about, okay, this is, realism says we shouldn't intervene in this case. And some people might say, well, who cares what realism says? It's bullshit anyway. Or liberal theory dictates that if they become democracies, we'll have peace. And somebody might say, well, what if liberal theory is wrong about that? And you just create all this damage for nothing. So using liberal theory as a reason to intervene or not, or realism as well, I think is a bit weak. So hopefully that answers your question. So I think maybe not. You might see a way that it fits in, but... Okay, Stelianos asks, can you give us some advice on how to present the argument and counter-argument? Okay. Well, maybe you can get more specific on the question. What do you mean by how to present it? You can show the counter-argument, okay, without us sounding like we haven't decided on what our opinion is. Okay, yeah, okay, definitely. So this whole time, when you first talk about the counter-argument, even just the way you phrase it suggests that, maybe you don't agree with that. You would say that these authors argue that, or these people say that this or that, and the argument here is, and by saying things like that, you distance yourself. these authors, the argument would be in that case, etc. So you're explaining the argument but by saying it would be, or this is what people say, or some have argued. It's not clear to the reader whether you agree with it. And if you've set it up in the introduction and you've clearly stated what you believe, it'll be clear as well. So you create a little bit of distance. Whereas with the argument, you wouldn't say the argument is or this would be. You say this happens, this is obviously true, etc. Same thing when you're tearing it down. You say the argument is attractive. However, it has the following flaws. Not according to my argument, it would have the following flaws. No, it has the following flaws. This is your opinion. People are free to say, no, that's wrong. So you don't have to be half-half about it. So Roberta said, is it a good idea to apply theory in general for CSI or rather empirical examples or both? Yeah, I mean, that's going to be an opinion, kind of an opinion question. So I myself am kind of a theorist. My thesis is on theory, but at the same time, I'm extremely skeptical of theories because I think that they blind people. They start thinking in this theory direction and they stop looking at what's actually happening. So I'm a bit skeptical of theories. I think you can use theory for a theoretical argument, but you should always try to use empirical examples if you can. You can't always, for example, statistics are not always going to be possible, and statistics can be misleading. So you could talk about the number of war deaths being lower after the Cold War, which many of you did in your essays. The potential problem with that is it a result of the Cold War because they were falling during the Cold War as well, or is it something else? How do you explain the numbers? So just showing the numbers doesn't guarantee they're going to keep going down. Maybe they'll start going up again at some point. So you need theory to explain why something is going down or up. But this is more of a theoretical and philosophical question about how we know what we know. I'm not sure I can cover it accurately or in enough depth now. What newspapers to rely on for objectivity and truth, not tampered documents? Well, all documents are tampered. All newspapers are going to have one view or the other. I have ones that I read that I think are good, but probably others think they're completely biased. Generally, state-backed media are not going to be free. However, they can be very useful to find out what that state thinks and how it does things. So if you read, for example, if you're studying China, then finding out what Chinese media say about things can be really useful, even though they're state-backed. So I recommend reading different perspectives to try to get, and also different country perspectives if possible. If you speak a foreign language, that's really helpful. As I pointed out with Ukraine, I really like German media because there are a lot of pro-Russian people in Germany and pro-Western, and Germany is sort of on the cusp between West and East in many ways, and that's how it sees itself. So you'll have very interesting. In Britain, there was no real debate about what side was right in Ukraine. It was the West, obviously. In Germany, there was considerable debate about which side was right, and reading that, I'm convinced that the West was correct, yes, but there's a lot of arguments on the other side, and they present them and they talk about them. So anyone who's not talking about any counter-arguments or not showing counter-examples, if you watch a documentary about something and they don't interview anybody who might be on the other side of this, you should be suspicious. So, yeah, that's kind of a way to tell, but reading broadly is probably the best thing. Yeah, and then there are newspapers. I mean, the Daily Mail is probably not the best place to get your foreign policy advice, things like that. Things like The Economist and The Atlantic, the German newspaper Die Zeit, these are better places. The Times, The Guardian, those are newspapers with a better reputation to defend. I think that makes more sense. Okay. So we have the question, can the war on terror be won by either side? To assume that the question is assuming war has... What? Assume the question is applying yes, no, is that absolute? Okay. Can it be won by either side? Yeah, you can talk about that. You can talk about whether it's absolute or not, and whether an absolute victory on one side or the other makes sense. Um, Joy sent me an interesting article. It was in Foreign Affairs in 2007 about winning the war on terror, saying that this was a long-term thing. It was going to be something like the Cold War, potentially even longer, because it's also an ideological conflict. I forget who the author was, but he was arguing that it's an ideological conflict about liberal values versus the values that Islamists hold dear, and which of those values would win out. In the end, he's arguing that, you know, we need to be better. We need to offer a better alternative to the Islamist idea, and wait. And eventually, everyone would say, we're sick of this stuff, and we're moving to something else, just as the Cold War did, just as communism ended up being discredited by itself. So yeah, that could bring an absolute end to it. Or you could argue an absolute end, ending terrorism itself. Terrorism as a tactic doesn't make sense. People might always use terrorism, so how could we possibly do that? And then you could say a more interesting question would be how we reduce the impact of terrorism, right? You could say that instead. Or how we keep terrorism from damaging our lives too considerably. Or you could reason that the one side has absolutely no chance of winning, so eventually the other side must prevail. So even if it's an absolute question, you can of course counter the question and say, well, that doesn't really make sense. I would argue neither side is definitely going to win, but this side has a much better chance of winning out overall. Even if terrorism doesn't stop, you might argue that the West is going to survive, whereas eventually the terrorism will mostly die out, or will hit a point where it no longer gains ground, or something like that.